The afternoon sun was blazing over the English Channel on June 23, 1942, and Oberleutnant Armin Faber was flying home with blood pounding in his temples and his heart racing with the intoxicating rush of combat. He had just helped shoot down a Spitfire over Devon, watching it spiral toward the green patchwork fields below, and now he was leading his squadron back to occupied France in his Focke-Wulf 190, the Luftwaffe's newest and most lethal fighter aircraft, a machine so advanced that Allied pilots had been calling it the butcher bird because of the way it carved through their formations like a scythe through wheat. For 8 months, this angular radial engine monster had been decimating RAF squadrons with impunity, its BMW engine howling like a banshee as it outclimbed, outran, and outgunned every Allied fighter in the sky, and the British were desperate to understand how the Germans had leapfrogged so far ahead in aviation technology. Their intelligence officers stayed up nights studying grainy reconnaissance photos and debriefing traumatized pilots who described an enemy aircraft that seemed to break every rule they thought they knew about aerial combat. Faber was 23 years old, a rising star in Jagerschwader too, with movie star looks and the kind of confidence that comes from flying an aircraft that makes you feel invincible. And as he banked his FW-190 through the clouds that day, his mind was already drifting toward the evening ahead, perhaps a celebration with his squadron mates, perhaps a letter home to his family in Germany describing another successful mission without mentioning the gnawing fear that lived in every fighter pilot's chest, the knowledge that one mistake, one moment of inattention, could turn you from predator to prey in the span of a heartbeat. The problem started innocuously enough. Faber's squadron had scattered during the dogfight, and in the chaos of spinning aircraft and tracer fire stitching through the sky, he had lost visual contact with his wingmen, a dangerous situation but not uncommon in the confusing three-dimensional chess game of air combat where every cloud could hide an enemy and every second demanded split-second decisions that meant life or death. He dropped down through the cloud layer looking for familiar landmarks, his eyes scanning the coastline below, and here is where the human brain's capacity for catastrophic error reveals itself in the most mundane way imaginable. Faber had become disoriented during the combat. His usually reliable sense of direction scrambled by the violent maneuvers and adrenaline, and when he saw an airfield below with a grass runway and dispersal areas that looked exactly like the Luftwaffe bases he had flown from 100 times before, his exhausted mind simply filled in the blanks, assuming he was looking at Cherbourg or one of the other German-occupied fields along the northern French coast. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine, constantly taking shortcuts to make sense of the overwhelming flood of sensory information we receive every second, and in that moment Faber's brain saw what it expected to see rather than what was actually there, a cognitive bias that was about to hand the Allies the intelligence coup of the entire war. He lowered his landing gear, lined up his approach, and brought the FW-190 in for a textbook landing, the wheels kissing the grass with barely a bump, and he was already unbuckling his harness and sliding back the canopy, breathing in what he thought was the familiar air of occupied France, when he noticed something odd about the aircraft parked near the hangars. They had roundels, the circular red, white, and blue markings of the Royal Air Force, and his blood turned to ice water as his brain finally processed what his eyes were seeing. He had landed at RAF Pembrey in South Wales, nearly 200 miles from where he thought he was, and he was surrounded by British Spitfires, and suddenly there were airmen running toward him from all directions, their faces showing a mixture of shock and elation that would have been almost comical if Faber's life wasn't hanging by a thread in that moment. He scrambled to restart the engine, his hands shaking as he worked the controls, but the FW-190's BMW radial engine was notoriously difficult to hot start, and by the time the propeller began to turn, British personnel had reached the aircraft and were climbing onto the wings, their hands grabbing at him through the open cockpit while others blocked the runway with vehicles, and Faber, who spoke no English and was still trying to process how he could have made such a catastrophically stupid mistake, finally raised his hands in surrender, becoming in that instant the most valuable prisoner of war the British would capture during the entire air campaign. The intelligence officers who arrived within hours could barely contain their excitement. Here, dropped into their laps like a gift from the aviation gods, was a pristine example of the Focke-Wulf 190, the aircraft that had been terrorizing their pilots and shifting the balance of air superiority over the channel, and more importantly, they had the pilot who could tell them everything about its capabilities, its weaknesses, its operational characteristics, and the tactics the Luftwaffe used to exploit its advantages. The FW-190 that sat on the Pembry grass that afternoon represented the culmination of years of German engineering brilliance, a response to the Soviet fighters that had surprised the Luftwaffe on the Eastern Front, and a leap forward in design philosophy that had left British aircraft manufacturers scrambling to catch up. Where British fighters like the Spitfire used liquid-cooled inline engines that were elegant but vulnerable to damage, the FW-190 used an air-cooled radial engine that could absorb tremendous punishment and keep flying, and where British fighters prioritized maneuverability at the expense of other qualities, the German designers had created an aircraft that excelled in speed, roll rate, climb rate, and firepower, essentially winning at everything except the tightest turning fights. The aircraft's radial engine placement also gave it an unusual appearance, with a short, pugnacious nose that made it look like a flying bulldog, and its wide-track landing gear made it far more stable on the ground than the narrow-geared Spitfire, which had a nasty habit of ground looping and killing inexperienced pilots during takeoff and landing. When the test pilots from the Royal Aircraft Establishment got their hands on Faber's FW-190, which had been given the RAF serial number MP499 and would become the most intensively studied aircraft of the war, they discovered performance characteristics that confirmed their pilots' worst fears and exceeded them in several respects. Captain Eric Winkelbrown, who would eventually become the most experienced test pilot in history with more aircraft types flown than anyone before or since, was among the first to fly the captured Focke-Wulf, and his reports sent shockwaves through the RAF hierarchy because they revealed just how comprehensively the Germans had outclassed British fighter design in almost every meaningful category. Brown found that the FW-190 could outdive any Allied fighter by a significant margin, meaning German pilots could always break off combat and escape if things went badly, and its roll rate was so superior that it could reverse direction faster than a Spitfire pilot could track it, making deflection shooting nearly impossible. The aircraft would simply roll into a new flight path before the pursuing pilot could adjust his aim, a tactical advantage that translated directly into survival rates and kill ratios. The cockpit layout impressed Brown with its thoughtful ergonomics, everything positioned where a pilot's hands would naturally fall during combat, with a single control lever that managed propeller pitch, throttle, and mixture simultaneously, freeing the pilot to focus on fighting rather than engine management. Whereas British fighters required constant attention to multiple controls that could distract from the life-or-death business of aerial combat. Perhaps most troubling was the armament. The FW-190 that Faber had delivered to the RAF carried two 7.92mm machine guns in the cowling and 420mm cannons, two in the wing roots and two in the outer wings, giving it devastating firepower that could saw a bomber in half with a single burst, and later variants would mount even heavier weapons including 30mm cannons that could destroy a B-17 Flying Fortress with just a few hits. The tactical implications were staggering. Allied bomber formations that had been suffering terrible losses over Germany were facing an enemy fighter that could stand off beyond the range of their defensive machine guns and use its superior speed and climb rate to choose when and where to attack, then break off with impunity before escort fighters could respond. The discovery of the FW-190's capabilities triggered an emergency response in British aircraft design and tactics that rippled through the war effort for the next 2 years. Supermarine, the manufacturer of the Spitfire, immediately began developing improved versions with more powerful engines and clipped wings to improve roll rate, while Hawker accelerated development of the Tempest, a new fighter specifically designed to counter the German aircraft's advantages. More immediately, RAF tactics changed to emphasize the importance of altitude advantage and formation integrity. Pilots were taught to stay together and use their numbers to compensate for individual aircraft inferiority, and to avoid the kinds of turning fights where the Spitfire's superior maneuverability gave it an edge, because the FW-190 pilot would simply refuse to play that game and use his aircraft's strengths instead. Intelligence gathered from Faber during his interrogation revealed operational details about Luftwaffe fighter tactics, squadron organization, and pilot training that helped RAF planners understand how the Germans were using their technological advantage. And while Faber was a professional who tried to reveal as little as possible, the mere fact of the aircraft's capture meant that every secret of its design and performance was now an open book. The British were so concerned about German intelligence discovering that they had captured an intact FW-190 that they went to extraordinary lengths to conceal the aircraft's existence, moving it between airfields under heavy security and limiting test flights to times when German reconnaissance aircraft were unlikely to be operating. And they were successful enough that the Luftwaffe High Command didn't learn about Faber's blunder until much later, when they had already changed some tactical procedures based on the assumption that their secrets were still safe. The psychological impact on Allied pilots of knowing exactly what they were facing, and more importantly, knowing that their commanders understood the threat and were working to counter it, cannot be overstated. The FW-190 had seemed like an invincible bogeyman in the sky, but now it was just another aircraft with known strengths and exploitable weaknesses, and that transformation from mysterious terror to understood opponent made a tangible difference in pilot morale and combat effectiveness. Test data from MP-499 informed the design of the American P-47 Thunderbolt, which used similar radial engine technology and a comparable design philosophy emphasizing firepower and survivability over pure maneuverability, and the later P-51 Mustang benefited from understanding how the Germans had optimized their aircraft for high-speed combat rather than dogfighting. The Americans, with their massive industrial capacity and engineering resources, were able to take the lessons learned from the captured FW-190 and incorporate them into aircraft that would eventually help achieve air superiority over Europe, but this process took years, and in the meantime, pilots in Spitfires and P-40s and other aircraft continued to face the Focke-Wulf knowing they were bringing inferior tools to a gunfight. Armin Faber spent the rest of the war in a prisoner-of-war camp, no doubt replaying that fateful moment when he mistook Wales for France over and over in his mind, knowing that his single error had potentially cost German lives and compromised one of the Luftwaffe's most important tactical advantages. After the war, he returned to Germany and lived quietly, rarely speaking about his wartime experience and certainly never publicly discussing the capture of his aircraft, though one can only imagine the mixture of shame and relief he must have felt. Shame at having made such a catastrophic mistake, relief at having survived the war when so many of his squadron mates had been killed. The FW-190 he delivered that day, RAF serial MP-499, flew with British markings for several years, appearing in training exercises and evaluation flights that helped shape Allied fighter development throughout the war, and it was eventually placed in storage after the war ended, a museum piece that represented one of the most significant intelligence windfalls of the entire conflict. The story of how one pilot's moment of disorientation changed the course of aerial warfare illustrates the razor-thin margins that separate success from failure in combat, where a single navigational error could have strategic implications that rippled across entire theaters of war, and it reminds us that for all our sophisticated technology and careful planning, human factors, fatigue, stress, cognitive bias, simple mistakes, remain the wild card that can undo even the most carefully guarded secrets. The Focke-Wulf 190 continued to serve the Luftwaffe until the end of the war, but it never again enjoyed the same mysterious superiority it had possessed in those early months of 1942, before Armin Faber made his wrong turn and landed on the wrong side of the channel, and while German engineers continued to refine and improve the design, creating variants with more powerful engines and heavier armament, the Allies always had that baseline understanding of its capabilities to work from, that captured example sitting in British hangars being measured and tested and understood in ways that no amount of combat observation could have achieved. Today, aviation historians regard the capture of Faber's FW-190 as one of the pivotal moments of the air war, not because it immediately reversed the course of the conflict. The Germans continued to produce excellent aircraft and the air campaign remained brutally contested until the final days of the war, but because it represented a fundamental shift in the intelligence balance, a moment when the fog of war lifted just enough to allow the Allies to understand their enemy's capabilities and develop counters, and because it demonstrated how a single human error, a moment of confusion in the cockpit,